Grace stood on the porch of her weathered wooden house, the salty tang of the Pacific Ocean filling her nostrils. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dunes, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. She watched as her two sons, Ethan and Ryan, chased each other along the shore, their laughter carried on the breeze. It was a scene of idyllic beauty, yet a deep ache resonated in Grace's heart. A dusty pickup truck pulled into the driveway, and Carl stepped out, his tall frame casting an even longer shadow. His face, weathered and lined like an old seaman's map, held a weariness that went beyond the day's work. He carried a brown paper bag, its aroma hinting at something stronger than groceries. "Evening, Grace," he said gruffly. "Brought you some fresh crab. Figured the boys would be hungry." A faint smile touched Grace's lips. "You're too kind, Carl. Thank you." He shrugged, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. "Just trying to help out." He handed her the bag, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. A spark, unexpected and unwelcome, shot through her. Ever since her husband, David, had been lost at sea 3 years ago, Carl had become her rock, a gruff but dependable presence in her life. He'd taken over David's role on the Seafarer, their family fishing boat, and made sure Grace and the boys were never in need. But lately there had been a shift in their relationship, an unspoken tension that hummed beneath the surface of their daily interactions. Grace felt it in the way his eyes lingered on her, in the gruff tenderness of his voice, in the lingering scent of salt water and engine oil that clung to his clothes. And she knew, with a growing sense of dread, that she felt it too. She was drawn to his strength, his resilience, the way he carried his grief with a quiet dignity that mirrored her own. He was a man carved from the same rugged coastline as their town, a man who understood the capricious nature of the sea, the fragility of life. But he was also her father-in-law, a man old enough to be her father. The thought of acting on her feelings, of betraying the memory of her husband, filled her with a shame so profound it threatened to consume her. "Carl," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "why don't you come in for dinner?" He hesitated, his gaze meeting hers for a fleeting moment before he looked away. "Don't want to intrude," he mumbled. "Your family," Grace insisted, her voice stronger now, though her heart pounded in her chest. "And besides, the boys would love to hear about today's catch." Carl nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He followed her into the house, the scent of salt water and crab clinging to him like a second skin. As Grace watched him play with her sons, their laughter filling the small kitchen, she knew she was on dangerous ground. A ground where love and loss, guilt and desire intertwined in a tangled web that threatened to ensnare them both. Astoria had always been Grace's world. Growing up, she'd spent countless hours on the docks, watching the fishing boats return with their hauls of salmon, tuna, and Dungeness crab. The salty air, the cries of gulls, the rhythmic clang of boat engines, these were the sounds of her childhood, the soundtrack to her life. Some kids dreamed of escaping Astoria, of going to college, of finding a life beyond the small town. But for Grace, the ocean held a magnetic pull. A sense of belonging that she couldn't find anywhere else. It was in her blood, passed down from generations of fishermen who had made their living from the sea. She'd met David, her husband, on the docks when they were both teenagers. He was tall and strong, with a sun-kissed smile that could melt her heart. He, too, was born to the sea, his family owning one of the most successful fishing boats in Astoria. Their love story was a simple one, woven from shared laughter, salty kisses, and the promise of a life together, anchored to the rhythms of the sea. They married young, barely out of high school, and Grace moved into the cozy house that David had built for them, overlooking the harbor. David's family welcomed her with open arms. Carl, his father, was a gruff but kind man, his hands roughened by years of hauling nets and battling storms. Susan, his mother, had a heart as big as the Pacific Ocean, always ready with a warm meal and a sympathetic ear. David's younger sister Amy was Grace's closest confidant, sharing dreams of escaping Astoria and finding adventure in far-off lands. Amy did just that, marrying a French photographer and moving to Paris to pursue a life of art and travel. But for Grace, Astoria held everything she ever wanted. She found joy in the simple things, tending her garden, baking bread, watching her sons grow strong and healthy. And when David returned from a fishing trip, his arms laden with fresh seafood and his eyes filled with love for her. She felt a contentment that nothing else could match. Life on the Oregon coast was a simple, predictable rhythm, dictated by the tides and the seasons. Grace found a comfortable routine in her days, packing lunches for David and Carl, waving goodbye as the seafarer chugged out of the harbor, then tending to her garden, mending nets, and chasing after her two rambunctious sons. The boys, Ethan and Ryan, were born on the Seafarer, arriving earlier than expected during one of David's longer fishing trips. It was a tradition in their family, a legacy passed down from generations of fishermen, to be born under the watchful gaze of the sea. Carl and Susan doted on their grandsons, teaching them to cast a fishing line before they could even walk. They spent their early years on the boat, cradled in the salty air, lulled to sleep by the rocking waves. When Ethan turned 5 and Ryan 4, Susan insisted they move back to the mainland, to a small house near the harbor. It was time for the boys to start school, to experience life beyond the deck of the Seafarer. Grace reluctantly agreed. She missed the open sea, the feel of the wind in her hair, the comforting rhythm of the waves. But she knew it was the right thing for her sons. Susan, ever the devoted grandmother, decided to return to the boat, taking over the cooking and cleaning duties so Grace could focus on the boys. Life settled into a new rhythm, a comfortable balance between land and sea. But the sea, as Grace knew all too well, could be a cruel mistress. One stormy November morning, the Seafarer failed to return to port. A frantic search ensued, the Coast Guard combing the coastline for any sign of the missing boat. 2 agonizing days later, Carl was found clinging to a life raft, battered but alive. His voice, hoarse with grief and exhaustion, delivered the news that shattered Grace's world. The Seafarer had been caught in a rogue wave, capsized and swallowed by the unforgiving sea. Susan and David were gone, their bodies lost to the depths. At 23, Grace found herself a widow, a single mother, her life ripped apart by the same sea that had always been her solace. The grief that descended upon Grace was a crushing weight, threatening to suffocate her. She'd lost not only her husband, but her mother-in-law, her anchor, the woman who'd taught her how to navigate the choppy waters of marriage and motherhood. And Carl, her once strong and stoic father-in-law, was broken, his spirit as shattered as the wreckage of the Seafarer. At 60, he looked 20 years older, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow with a grief that seemed to have aged him overnight. He refused to set foot on another boat, the sea having taken too much from him. The salty air, once a source of comfort, now brought only the bitter sting of loss. He retired from fishing, taking a job at the shipyard, repairing boats that would sail the seas he no longer dared to conquer. He spent his days surrounded by the ghosts of his past, the scent of sawdust and engine oil, a constant reminder of what he'd lost. Grace, too, was lost, adrift in a sea of grief. But she had 2 young sons who needed her, 2 little anchors that kept her tethered to this world. She forced herself to rise each morning, to go through the motions of daily life. She took a job at the fish market, selling the catch that other men brought in, her hands stained with the blood and scales of creatures that reminded her of her husband, her life before the storm. She moved back into the house she'd shared with David, the house that now echoed with emptiness. Carl, haunted by his own grief, moved in with her, a silent specter sharing her sorrow. They were a family broken by the sea, clinging to each other for survival. They ate their meals in silence, their eyes avoiding contact, each lost in their own private ocean of pain. The boys, Ethan and Ryan, were too young to fully comprehend the magnitude of their loss. They still asked for their father, their voices filled with a naive hope that made Grace's heart ache. But they clung to Carl, their grandfather, seeking comfort in his gruff affection, his silent strength. And slowly, tentatively, a bond began to form between Grace and Carl. They were 2 souls adrift, battered by the same storm, clinging to each other for warmth in the cold, dark waters of their grief. Carl poured all his love and heartache into his grandsons. They were his lifeline, his reason to keep going. He doted on Ethan and Ryan, his gruff exterior melting away when he was with them. He taught them to fish, to build sandcastles, to identify the different types of seashells that littered the beach. Watching them play, their laughter echoing through the house, filled a small part of the gaping hole in Carl's heart. It was in their bright eyes, their boundless energy, that he glimpsed a glimmer of the life that had been stolen from him. Grace, too, found solace in her sons. They were a constant reminder of David, their smiles and mannerisms echoes of the man she had loved so deeply. She watched them grow, their personalities blossoming, each one a unique blend of her and David. Ethan, the older one, inherited his father's quiet strength and love of the sea. Ryan, the younger, was a whirlwind of energy and laughter, his mischievous grin a carbon copy of David's. Amy, back in Astoria for a brief visit, watched the growing bond between her father and sister-in-law with a mixture of concern and hope. She knew they were both hurting, both struggling to navigate the treacherous waters of grief. "Grace, you need to think about your future," Amy said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You're still young. Don't let David's death define the rest of your life." Grace sighed, her gaze fixed on the distant waves. "I'm not sure I'm ready to move on, Amy. Besides, who would want me? A widow with 2 young children." "Don't be ridiculous," Amy chided. "You're beautiful, Grace, and any man would be lucky to have you and the boys." She paused, her voice softening. "And what about Carl? He's still a young man, relatively speaking. Don't you think he deserves a chance at happiness, too?" The thought of Carl with another woman, another wife, sent a strange pang through Grace's heart. She'd become accustomed to his presence in her life, his gruff affection, his silent support. She'd tried dating, had even gone out with a few men from town, but none of them could compare to Carl. They lacked his quiet strength, his understanding of the sea, his shared history of loss. The idea of moving on, of finding someone new, felt like a betrayal of David's memory. And yet, as she watched Carl play with her sons, his laughter echoing in the twilight, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were all trapped in a cycle of grief, unable to break free and embrace the possibility of a new beginning. The thought of reliving the agony of losing another husband to the sea was unbearable to Grace. The ocean had already taken so much from her. It was a risk she couldn't bear to take again. "I can't," she confessed to Amy, her voice trembling. "I can't go through that pain again." Carl, overhearing their conversation, declared that he too would never remarry. He would dedicate the rest of his life to honoring the memory of his wife and son, to raising his grandsons. But as the weeks turned into months, Grace found herself drawn to Carl in a way that both frightened and confused her. It was more than just gratitude, more than just shared grief. It was a deep, soul-stirring connection that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. She saw the tenderness in his eyes when he looked at her sons, the way his rough hands gently brushed away a tear from Ethan's cheek, the quiet strength he radiated even in his darkest moments. And she realized, with a growing sense of unease, that she wasn't just drawn to his love for her sons. She was drawn to him, to the man beneath the grief-stricken facade, to the quiet depths of his soul. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just a misplaced sense of gratitude, a longing for the comfort and stability he represented. But the truth was undeniable. She was falling in love with her father-in-law. The guilt was a heavy weight, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She felt like a traitor, a woman who was desecrating the memory of her husband. She cried herself to sleep at night, her pillows stained with tears of shame and confusion. How could she feel this way? It was wrong, taboo, a violation of the natural order of things. What would people say? What would her sons think? What would David think, looking down from whatever heaven awaited those lost at sea? She was a young woman, full of life, with a future stretched out before her. She'd survived the loss of her husband, had found a way to navigate the world as a single mother. But this forbidden attraction to Carl threatened to undo her, to send her spiraling into an abyss of guilt and despair. The loneliness was a constant ache, a gnawing emptiness that threatened to consume Grace. The nights were the hardest, the silence of the house amplifying the longing in her heart. She missed David's warmth beside her, the sound of his laughter, the comforting weight of his arm around her waist. Astoria was a small town, and news of her widowhood traveled fast. The men in town, many of them fishermen who understood the harsh realities of life and loss, offered their condolences, their words often laced with a hint of something more. They'd stop by with fresh salmon or Dungeness crab, just to help out. Their eyes lingering on her a little too long, their smiles a little too suggestive. They'd invite Carl out for a drink, hoping to loosen his tongue, to gauge his reaction to their thinly veiled advances towards his daughter-in-law. Grace saw through their charades, their clumsy attempts at courtship disguised as neighborly concern. She found it both flattering and repulsive. Part of her craved the attention, the validation that she was still desirable, still a woman worthy of love. But another part, the part that still clung to David's memory, recoiled at the thought of replacing him, of betraying the vows they'd made on that sunny day by the sea. Some nights, fueled by whiskey and loneliness, the men would stumble up to her porch, their voices slurred, their intentions clear. They'd call out her name, their words a mix of flattery and desperation. "Grace, honey, you shouldn't be alone on a night like this. Let me keep you warm." Carl, ever protective, would chase them off, his gruff voice booming through the night, his fists clenched. He'd stand guard on the porch, his silhouette a reassuring presence against the darkness. "Don't you worry, Grace," he'd say, his voice softening as he looked at her. "I won't let anyone hurt you." And in those moments, as she stood behind him, the warmth of his body a shield against the cold night air, Grace felt a surge of gratitude that mingled with something deeper, something dangerous and forbidden. "Don't let them take advantage of you, Grace," Carl would say, his voice gruff with concern. "They're just lonely, looking for a warm body. They don't really care about you." "I know, Carl," Grace would reply, her voice soft. "It's just hard. Sometimes I feel so lost, so alone." "You're not alone, Grace," Carl would say, his hand resting on her shoulder, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "You have me, and the boys." He was right, of course. She had her sons, her anchors in the storm. And she had Carl, her rock, her protector, the one constant in her ever-shifting world. Amy, ever the pragmatic one, tried to nudge Grace towards a new life. "You should get out there, Grace. Date. Find someone who can make you happy." Grace had gone on a few dates, had even met a divorced man from Portland who seemed kind and decent. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was comparing them all to Carl, measuring them against his quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty. "It's just not the same, Amy," she confessed. "None of them are like Carl." Amy sighed. "Grace, you can't keep comparing everyone to your father-in-law. He's not your husband, and he never will be." Then Amy, always the matchmaker, tried to set Grace up with a Vietnamese-American businessman named Michael. He'd been widowed a few years earlier and had a successful import-export business in Portland. "He's a good man, Grace, and he's looking for someone special," Amy insisted. Michael was charming, successful, and seemed genuinely interested in Grace, but he made it clear that he wasn't interested in raising another man's children. He proposed sending Ethan and Ryan to boarding school, promising to provide them with the best education money could buy. The thought of sending her sons away, of severing the last tangible connection she had to David, was unbearable. She tearfully declined Michael's proposal, her heart breaking for her sons, for herself, for the life she'd once dreamed of. Amy, seeing Grace's despair, decided to take matters into her own hands. She enrolled Grace in English classes, urging her to find a job in Portland, to start a new life away from the constant reminders of her loss. "You need to get away from here, Grace," Amy pleaded. "Find a fresh start. Meet new people. Maybe even find a nice European man who'll sweep you off your feet and take you and the boys to Paris." Grace, hesitant but desperate for a change, agreed. She found a job as a waitress in a trendy Portland restaurant, a world away from the fish markets and salty air of Astoria. She left the boys in Carl's care, promising to visit them every weekend. She missed them terribly, but the bustling city life, the anonymity of being just another face in the crowd, provided a temporary escape from her grief. "Face it, Grace," Amy said, her voice blunt but kind. "Not every man wants to be a ready-made father to 2 kids who aren't his own. You need to find someone who's more open-minded." And so, Grace found herself working in a bustling Portland bar, a far cry from the quiet taverns of Astoria. She learned to pour a perfect pint of Guinness, to navigate the late-night crowds, to handle the occasional drunken advances with a cool smile and a firm refusal. She'd blossomed in the city, her natural beauty enhanced by a touch of makeup, her wardrobe updated with clothes that hinted at the curves she'd kept hidden beneath layers of flannel and fleece. The sadness in her eyes, the lingering grief that shadowed her smile, only seemed to make her more alluring to the men who frequented the bar. It wasn't long before she caught the attention of Daniel, a handsome Australian tourist with sun-kissed skin and a charming accent. He was traveling the world, working odd jobs and soaking up new experiences. He was drawn to Grace's quiet strength, her exotic beauty, the hint of melancholy that lingered in her gaze. He was everything Carl wasn't. Young, carefree, with a zest for life that Grace found both exhilarating and intimidating. She found herself falling into his arms, her body responding to his touch with a fierceness that surprised her. She enjoyed the lightness of their relationship, the stolen moments in his hostel room, the long walks along the Willamette River, the way he made her forget, for a few precious hours, the weight of her grief. She tried to keep her feelings for Carl buried, locked away in the deepest recesses of her heart. But every time she was with Daniel, every time she felt the heat of his touch, the memory of Carl's strength, his unwavering presence, intruded upon her thoughts. She'd close her eyes, and she'd see Carl's broad shoulders, the way his flannel shirt stretched across his chest, the way his calloused hands had held her so gently when she'd received the news of David's death. And she'd ache for him, for a connection that was both forbidden and undeniable. The memories haunted her, blending together in a confusing, intoxicating mix of desire and guilt. Even in the arms of her Australian lover, she'd find herself thinking of Carl, of his strong, calloused hands, his quiet, watchful gaze. She'd remember the way he sat on the porch in the evenings, sipping a beer, his face etched with a sadness she knew mirrored her own. She'd see him in her mind's eye, his silhouette outlined against the fiery sunset, a solitary figure silhouetted against the vast expanse of the Pacific. The longing for Carl, for his familiar presence, for the comfort she found in his silences, grew stronger with each passing day. It was a yearning that went beyond the physical, a deep-seated need for a connection that transcended the boundaries of what was right and wrong. She was caught between two worlds, two men, two versions of herself. The carefree Grace, laughing in the arms of a handsome stranger, and the grieving widow, yearning for the comfort of a forbidden love. One night, after a particularly passionate encounter with Daniel, Grace woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. She missed her sons, missed the salty air of Astoria, missed the familiar creak of the porch swing at Carl's house. She knew she couldn't stay in Portland any longer. She needed to go home, needed to face the truth of her feelings, no matter how painful it might be. She quit her job, packed her bags, and rented a car. She called Amy and told her she was coming home, bringing Daniel with her. Amy, ever supportive, encouraged her to introduce Daniel to Carl, to see if he could accept the idea of Grace moving on with her life. "Maybe this is what you need, Grace," Amy said. "A fresh start, a new beginning." Daniel, eager to experience life in a small American town, readily agreed to accompany Grace to Astoria. He'd told her he loved her, had even hinted at the possibility of marriage, of a life together back in Australia. Grace knew he was sincere, knew that he saw a future with her, a future where they could build a life together, free from the shadows of her past. But a part of her, a part she couldn't silence, yearned for something more. Something that went beyond the whirlwind romance of a traveling fling. Daniel told Grace, with a sincerity that warmed her heart, that he'd fallen in love with her the moment he saw her, that he admired her strength and independence, that he was willing to embrace her past, her sons, everything that made her who she was. Unlike Michael, who'd wanted to erase her past, Daniel embraced it. He'd met her sons via video chat, had even sent them gifts from his travels. He seemed genuinely excited to meet them in person, to become a part of their lives. The day they arrived in Astoria, Ryan, Grace's youngest son, came down with a fever. Grace found Carl in the living room, his broad chest bare, his skin glistening with sweat as he used a cool compress to soothe Ryan's burning forehead. Carl looked up as Grace, Daniel, and Amy entered the house, his eyes widening in surprise. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow on his weathered features. To Grace he looked older, more worn down than she remembered. Her heart ached for him, for the burden of grief he carried so silently. She rushed to Ryan's side, her hand instinctively reaching out to touch his forehead. Ethan, who'd been playing outside, ran into the house, his eyes wide with concern for his little brother. He threw his arms around Carl, his small body trembling with worry. "Grandpa, is Ryan gonna be okay?" he asked, his voice choked with tears. Carl, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears, pulled Ethan close. "He'll be fine, son. Just a little fever. Your mama's home now. She'll take care of him." That evening, after Amy had taken Daniel to a local motel and the boys had fallen asleep, exhausted from a day of travel and worry, Grace found herself sitting on the porch with Carl, a bottle of whiskey between them. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. The moon, full and bright, cast an ethereal glow on Carl's face, highlighting the lines etched by grief and time. He poured them each a generous shot of whiskey, his hand steady despite the tremor that ran through him. "Why don't you find someone, Grace?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "The kids and I. We worry about you. You deserve to be happy." The question, so unexpected, so raw, caught Grace off guard. I don't know, Carl," she stammered, her gaze falling to the amber liquid swirling in her glass. "I'm not sure I'm ready." "You can't live in the past forever, Grace," he said, his voice softening. "David wouldn't want that." "He would want you to be happy, Grace," Carl said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's all that matters." Grace looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The whiskey had loosened her inhibitions, blurred the lines she'd drawn so carefully around her emotions. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, the longing that mirrored her own. And in that moment, under the watchful gaze of the moon, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the sea, she made a decision that would change their lives forever. She leaned towards him, her hand reaching out to touch his cheek, her fingers tracing the rough lines etched by time and grief. "Then make me happy, Carl," she whispered, her voice a mixture of desperation and desire. He looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise, his breath catching in his throat. He reached for her, his hand trembling as he cupped her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. "Grace," he breathed, his voice husky with emotion. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her eyes filled with a longing that had been buried for too long. And then they were in each other's arms, their lips meeting in a kiss that was both tender and fierce. A culmination of years of unspoken desire, of shared grief, of a love that had blossomed in the ashes of loss. That night they made love in Carl's bed, their bodies entwined, their souls merging in a way that transcended guilt and shame. It was a release, a catharsis, a way of reclaiming a part of themselves that had been lost at sea. Grace, consumed by the intensity of their lovemaking, felt a sense of completeness she'd never experienced before, not even with David. It was a primal, soul-stirring connection, a merging of two hearts that had been broken by the same storm. But as the sun rose, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, a wave of shame washed over Grace. What had she done? She'd betrayed David's memory, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She slipped out of Carl's bed, her body aching, her heart heavy with a mixture of guilt and exhilaration. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her blouse, her gaze avoiding Carl's sleeping form. She needed to get away, needed to clear her head, needed to find a way to reconcile the woman she'd been with, the woman she'd become. She drove back to Portland, her mind racing, her emotions a tangled mess. As she drove, she made a decision. She couldn't live a lie, couldn't pretend that what had happened between her and Carl hadn't changed everything. She called Daniel and broke things off, her voice trembling as she explained that she couldn't leave Astoria, couldn't leave her sons, couldn't leave Carl. She quit her job at the bar, packed up her belongings, and returned to the small house by the sea. She would face the consequences of her actions, no matter the cost. She would embrace her life in Astoria. Her love for Carl, her responsibility to her sons, the city with its noise and relentless pace suddenly felt suffocating to Grace. She longed for the familiar rhythm of the tides, the salty air, the sound of seagulls crying overhead. She missed her sons, missed the simplicity of their life in Astoria. Ignoring Amy's protests, she packed up her belongings and returned home, her heart filled with a newfound clarity. She would face the consequences of her actions, embrace the love she felt for Carl, no matter the whispers and judgments that might follow. She found Carl working at the shipyard, his strong hands calloused from years of working with wood and metal. He looked up as she approached, his eyes widening in surprise, his face etched with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Grace," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "What are you doing here?" "I'm home, Carl," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm home to stay." He didn't question her decision, didn't ask about Daniel, didn't push for explanations. He simply nodded, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. And so, Grace settled back into her life in Astoria. She returned to her job at the fish market, the familiar routine a comforting balm to her soul. She spent her evenings with Carl and the boys, cooking dinner, helping with homework, listening to their stories of school and friends. The nights were different now. The silence of the house was no longer a source of loneliness, but a shared intimacy. She and Carl would sit on the porch, sipping whiskey, watching the moon rise over the ocean, their conversations a mix of comfortable silences and unspoken understanding. And when the boys were asleep, they would find solace in each other's arms, their love a forbidden secret that bloomed in the darkness, a desperate attempt to fill the void left by their shared loss. Grace knew their relationship was wrong, knew it would be frowned upon by the conservative townsfolk, but she couldn't deny the love she felt for Carl, a love that was both passionate and tender, a love that had been forged in the fires of grief and loss. She needed him, craved his touch, his strength, his presence in her life. She needed him like the sea needed the moon, like the earth needed the sun, like a flower needed the rain. Their love was a dangerous undertow, pulling them deeper into a forbidden current, a whirlpool of desire that threatened to consume them both. Grace knew it was wrong, knew it was a love that could destroy them both, but she was powerless to resist, drawn into his arms like a moth to a flame, her body and soul surrendering to the intoxicating pull of their forbidden desire. Every night, she found herself in Carl's embrace, her body a willing vessel for his love, her senses consumed by the scent of his skin, the feel of his rough hands on her bare flesh. The passion they shared was fierce, a desperate attempt to outrun the ghosts that haunted them, to find solace in the heat of their forbidden embrace. She reveled in the stolen moments, the whispered words of love, the stolen kisses in the moonlight. But with each sunrise, a wave of guilt would wash over her, leaving her feeling tainted, unworthy. She'd avoid the eyes of her sons, afraid they'd see the truth reflected in her own. She couldn't bring herself to look at the photos of David and Susan that still hung on the wall, their smiling faces a constant reminder of her betrayal. The guilt gnawed at her, a constant undercurrent to the passion she felt for Carl. She'd lie awake at night, her mind racing, trying to make sense of her feelings, to understand how she'd fallen into this tangled web of forbidden love. Was it the shared grief, the unspoken bond forged in the crucible of loss that had drawn them together? Was it the loneliness, the ache of empty beds and silent nights that had blurred the lines of what was right and wrong? Or was it something deeper, a karmic debt from a past life, a love destined to play out, no matter the consequences? Grace didn't have the answers. All she knew was that she couldn't live without Carl, couldn't imagine a life without his touch, his strength, his presence in her world. But she also knew that their love was a dangerous game, a gamble with fate that could leave them both shattered. After a few months of living in this tumultuous whirlwind of passion and guilt, Carl announced that he was returning to the sea. He'd accepted a job as captain of a fishing vessel owned by a family friend, a boat that would take him far from Astoria, far from Grace, far from the temptation that threatened to consume them both. He told her he needed to do this, needed to find a way to make peace with his past, to honor the memory of his wife and son, to reclaim the part of himself that had been lost in the storm. He promised to send money home, enough to support Grace and the boys, enough to ease his conscience, to pay for the sin of loving the woman who should have been forbidden. And so, Carl sailed away, leaving Grace on the shore, her heart a mixture of relief and aching emptiness. He returned to the life he knew best, the life that had been both his salvation and his torment. He became a ghost, a whisper on the wind, a name spoken in hushed tones by the men who returned from sea with tales of his skill and daring. He sent letters, at first, filled with apologies and longing, with promises of a future together, a life beyond the judgment of their small town. But the letters grew shorter, less frequent, the words tinged with a sadness that mirrored Grace's own. She knew, deep down, that he was trying to protect her, trying to shield her from the scandal that their love would inevitably bring. He was also trying to protect himself, to distance himself from the temptation that gnawed at his conscience. But Carl couldn't know, that the day he sailed away, Grace carried a part of him within her, a tiny seed of their forbidden love growing beneath her heart. When she realized she was pregnant, a wave of fear washed over her. It was a secret she couldn't share, a burden she would bear alone. But as her belly swelled, a strange sense of peace settled over her. This child, this unexpected blessing, was a tangible reminder of their love, a part of Carl that would remain with her long after he'd sailed beyond the horizon. The news of her pregnancy, inevitable in a small town, spread like wildfire. Whispers followed Grace as she walked down the street, judgment veiled in concerned glances and hushed conversations. But the people of Astoria, weathered by the harsh realities of life at sea, possessed a resilience, a quiet acceptance of the vagaries of fate. No one confronted Grace. No one uttered a harsh word to her face. They helped her, as they had always done, bringing fresh fish and vegetables, offering to babysit Ethan and Ryan, their kindness a silent acknowledgement of her strength, her resilience. Grace gave birth to a daughter, a beautiful baby girl with Carl's piercing blue eyes and her own dark hair. She named her Lily, a symbol of hope and new beginnings, a fragile flower blooming in the shadow of their forbidden love. Carl, upon hearing the news of Lily's birth, fell silent. His letters stopped coming. His monthly payments ceased. He vanished from her life as completely as if he'd been swallowed by the sea itself. Years passed, seasons turned, and Grace raised her 3 children alone, her heart a bittersweet mix of love and regret. Ethan and Ryan grew tall and strong, their love for the sea undimmed by the loss of their father. Lily, a ray of sunshine in their lives, filled the house with her laughter, her spirit a testament to the enduring power of love, even a love born in the shadows. Grace never heard from Carl again. The rumors that swirled around his disappearance were like the ever-shifting tides, some claiming he'd been lost at sea, others whispering that he'd found a new life, a new love, in a distant port. She clung to the hope that he was alive, that he was happy, that he'd found a peace that eluded her. But a part of her, the part that still held his memory close, would forever be haunted by the ghost of their forbidden love. A love that had burned brightly but was destined to fade into the mist, a bittersweet memory carried on the salty breeze. As the years passed, whispers of Carl's fate drifted into Astoria with the tides. Some said he'd been lost at sea, his vessel swallowed by a storm. Others claimed he'd jumped ship in a foreign port, starting a new life far from the ghosts of his past. Grace's hair turned silver, her face etched with the lines of a life lived in the shadow of loss and longing. She raised her children alone, her heart a fortress of guarded emotions, her love for Carl a secret she carried like a precious, painful stone. She vowed that her sons would never follow their father and grandfather to the sea. It had taken too much from her, and she couldn't bear to watch it claim another generation of her family. "You'll go to college," she'd tell Ethan and Ryan. "You'll find good jobs, safe jobs, far from the dangers of the ocean." But the call of the sea was a siren song, a powerful lure that was difficult to resist. At 16, Ethan and Ryan, unable to bear the whispers and judgment that followed them like shadows, packed their bags and left Astoria without a word. Grace, her heart breaking, knew they'd overheard the gossip, knew they'd discovered the truth about Lily's parentage, about the forbidden love that had shattered their family. She'd failed them, failed to protect them from the harsh realities of the world, from the consequences of her own choices. She was their mother, their anchor, and she'd let them drift away, lost in a sea of their own making. Lily, too, felt the weight of their fractured family, the unspoken tension that hung heavy in the air. She adored her brothers, had cherished the few years they'd spent together before they'd left. They'd been her protectors, her confidantes, the only siblings she'd ever known. She, too, left Astoria when she turned 18, unable to escape the whispers, the judgment, the constant reminder of her father's absence. She moved to Portland, determined to create a life for herself, a life free from the shadows of her past. Grace remained in Astoria, alone in the house that had once been filled with laughter and love. The silence was deafening now, a constant reminder of her loss, her mistakes, her inability to keep her family together. She became a recluse, a ghost haunting the edges of the town, her heart a brittle shell, her spirit weathered by the relentless tides of grief and regret. She never heard from Carl or her sons again. The sea, which had once been her solace, had become her prison, a vast, unforgiving expanse that had swallowed her family whole. And as she sat on her porch, the years etched on her face like lines on a weathered map, she wondered if the sea would one day claim her too, if it would finally reunite her with the ghosts that haunted her dreams, if it would grant her the peace that had eluded her for so long. Grace's story is a reminder that love, even in its purest form, can have devastating consequences. It's a testament to the enduring power of grief, the weight of secrets, and the enduring allure of the sea, a force that can both give and take away, a force that shapes our lives in ways we can never fully comprehend. What are your thoughts on this tale of forbidden love and enduring loss? What would you have done in Grace's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.